May 1, 1960. 8:53 local time. The skies above Sverdlovsk, Soviet Union. A solitary shape etches a thin, white line across the deep blue of the stratosphere. 70,000 feet above the earth. Silence but for the faint, rhythmic whine of a single jet engine. The air is too thin for sound, too thin for clouds. From this altitude, the curvature of the planet is a visible, haunting fact. Inside the cramped cockpit of Article 360, Francis Gary Powers maintains his northerly heading. The frost on his canopy is permanent up here. Below him, through breaks in the high cirrus, the Ural Mountains look like wrinkles on a map. His mission, Operation Grand Slam, is nearly complete. A 7-hour flight from Peshawar, Pakistan to Bodo, Norway. A straight line across the heart of the Soviet Union. Photographing intercontinental ballistic missile sites, airfields, nuclear facilities. The cameras behind him were softly, gathering secrets on miles of film. He checks his instruments. All green. No warnings. No radar signals on his detection gear. He is, according to all previous missions, untouchable. A ghost in the upper atmosphere. 120,000 feet below, on a snow-dusted field outside Sverdlovsk, a new order of warfare is waiting. A battery of V-750 missiles, NATO calls them SA-2 guideline, erects skyward. Their radar has painted the high, slow-moving target. For years, Soviet air defense crews have watched these phantom tracks. Frustration has curdled into fury. Today, on May Day, the day of Soviet military might, the order is clear. Destroy the target. A launch officer barks a command. A plume of orange fire and black smoke erupts from the valley. Not one, but 3 missiles tear into the sky, climbing on pillars of flame at 3 times the speed of sound. They are not aimed at the aircraft. They are aimed at a point in the future, at a calculated intersection in the thin, cold air where the U-2 will be. In his cockpit, Powers sees nothing. Hears nothing. The first missile passes close, its proximity fuse detonating in a silent, sun-bright flash. The shockwave is a physical force. Article 360 convulses. The long, glider-like wings snap and fold backward. The cockpit tears away from the disintegrating fuselage. The myth of invulnerability shatters in the violent, airless silence of the stratosphere. A man in a pressure suit begins a long, tumbling fall toward the enemy Earth. While on the ground, Soviet technicians rush toward a debris field they are certain can contain only a corpse. The story of the U-2 begins not with an aircraft, but with a paralyzing fear. It is the early 1950s. The Cold War is freezing into a rigid, global stalemate. The United States possesses the atomic bomb, but so too does the Soviet Union. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction is taking its first, grim shape. Yet for American strategists, a more immediate terror lurks: the bomber gap. A flood of alarming intelligence reports, many based on Soviet boasts at military parades, suggests the USSR is building a vast fleet of intercontinental strategic bombers. These reports predict a future where Soviet wings darken American skies. The problem is one of verification. The Soviet Union is a closed empire, a denied area spanning 11 time zones. Its borders are sealed, its airspace defended by thousands of fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Conventional spy planes, like the RB-47, risk annihilation if they probe too deep. Human agents on the ground cannot comprehend the scale of industrial and military construction. The United States, for all its power, is blind. The need is clear: eyes over the heartland. The requirement is simple, yet seemingly impossible. An aircraft that can fly not at the edge of space but through its very threshold. It must cruise at an altitude so extreme that neither Soviet fighters nor their anti-aircraft artillery can reach it. It must be a camera platform, silent and invisible, a technological ghost. This problem lands on the desk of Edwin Land, the visionary inventor of the Polaroid camera. Land, heading a top-secret CIA advisory panel, proposes a radical solution: stop adapting military aircraft for espionage. Instead, build an entirely new plane from scratch, designed for one purpose only: to fly higher than anything else in the world. He recruits the only man he believes can do it: Clarence Kelly Johnson, the legendary mercurial chief engineer of Lockheed Skunk Works. Johnson's philosophy is brute force genius: be quick, quiet, and quality. In a secret hangar in Burbank, California, under the code name Aquatone, his team performs a miracle of aviation. The design they produce is less a fighter or a bomber and more a powered glider. The U-2 is all-wing, long, slender, and fragile. Its wingspan is longer than its fuselage. To save weight, its landing gear is a mere bicycle arrangement. It is so delicate that on the ground, its wingtips rest on removable supports called pogos. It is powered by a single massively upgraded jet engine, tuned to breathe the thin air of the stratosphere. But the aircraft is only half the story. The other half is the camera. Developed by Boston-based PerkinElmer, the Hycon B camera is a masterpiece of optics. Weighing over 450 pounds, it uses a massive 36-inch focal length lens. From 70,000 feet, its resolution is staggering. It can photograph a newspaper headline from 13 miles up. A single mission could image a strip of Soviet territory over 2,000 miles long and 300 miles wide, capturing every factory, rail yard, and missile site on miles of high-resolution film. The human element is equally specialized. The pilots are not military men in uniform. They are civilians. Recruited from the Air Force and Navy's best, they resign their commissions and are quietly hired by the CIA. Their cover story: they work for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the precursor to NASA, conducting high-altitude weather research. Their base of operations is not in the United States, but on the periphery of the Soviet Empire. In Sirlik in Turkey, Atsugi in Japan, and, crucially, Peshawar in Pakistan. From these remote outposts, they would embark on their long, lonely journeys into the void. The first operational overflight of the USSR occurred on July 4, 1956. The symbolism was not subtle. Piloted by Hervey Stockman, the U-2 took off from Wiesbaden, West Germany, and flew over Moscow, Leningrad, and the Baltic coast. Soviet radar tracked the blip immediately. MiG fighters scrambled, climbing with desperate urgency. But they stalled out, their engines gasping for oxygen, thousands of feet below the gliding U-2. Soviet ground commanders were furious, humiliated. They could see the contrail, a chalk mark of insult across their sovereign sky, but they could not touch it. For 4 years this would be the pattern. The U-2 flew with impunity. It mapped the Soviet nuclear arsenal, disproved the bomber gap, and revealed the true scale of Soviet missile development. It gave the White House a priceless strategic advantage: certainty. But below that pristine contrail, a deep, seething fury was building. The Soviet leadership, particularly Premier Nikita Khrushchev, viewed each overflight as a national humiliation. The invisible frontier of the stratosphere had been breached, and the USSR appeared powerless. Khrushchev berated his military commanders publicly and privately. The pressure on Soviet air defense to find a solution, any solution, became immense. The technological race was no longer just about building rockets. It was about finding a way to swat down the American Angel flying overhead. This absolute American confidence in technological supremacy would soon collide with a Soviet obsession for revenge, setting in motion a chain of events that would culminate on a clear May Day morning. In the Kremlin, the impotence was intolerable. Nikita Khrushchev, the volatile, shoe-banging leader of the Soviet Union, received the reconnaissance reports with a mixture of rage and dread. The American phantom was not just violating sovereignty, it was exposing the very heart of Soviet strategic deception. The USSR's perceived strength, a crucial currency in Cold War brinkmanship, was being meticulously catalogued and, worse, debunked. The missile gap that the Soviets hoped would cow the West was being measured and found wanting by the lenses of the U-2. For Khrushchev, this was a personal affront and a geopolitical catastrophe. He tasked his military with one directive: stop the overflights at any cost. The responsibility fell to the PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Forces. Their existing arsenal was useless. The MiG-19 fighters could barely reach 55,000 feet in a zoom climb, only to stall and fall back, utterly out of reach. Anti-aircraft guns were mere fireworks at such altitudes. The solution had to be radical. It lay in the rapid evolution of surface-to-air missile technology, a field where Soviet engineers, led by brilliant designers like Pyotr Grushin and Alexander Raspoltin, were making formidable strides. The chosen weapon was the S-75 Dvina, NATO designation, SA-2 guideline. It was a two-stage command-guided missile. A solid fuel booster rocket launched it from its rail, then fell away, igniting a liquid fuel sustainer that propelled it to Mach 3.5. It didn't need to hit the aircraft directly. Its warhead, packed with 430 pounds of high explosives, was designed to detonate via radio proximity fuse, shredding anything within a 200-foot radius with a storm of steel fragments. But to kill, it first had to see. And to see, it needed an integrated system of eyes and brains, the Fansong fire control radar. This network of radars, acquisition, tracking, and guidance, had to lock onto a small, high-flying target and guide the missile to its terminal burst within human precision. For years this system had a critical flaw. The U-2's operational altitude, above 68,000 feet, existed in a radar gap. The curvature of the Earth and the limitations of radar propagation meant the S-75's fan song could not see high enough to acquire a lock. The U-2 flew in a radar shadow of its own making. But Soviet engineers worked frantically. They pushed the radar systems to their extreme limits, increasing power, refining frequencies, and deploying them in greater numbers to create overlapping fields of coverage. They began to slant their coverage, aiming radars at steeper angles. The gap was narrowing millimeter by electronic millimeter. Simultaneously, Soviet intelligence, the KGB and GRU, were not idle. Through a global network of agents and informants, they pieced together clues about the mysterious aircraft. They knew its general operating basis. They understood its flight profiles. They even acquired fragments of its unique, lightweight fuel, a special low-volatility formulation needed for high altitude, from a crash in Japan. They were building a picture of their adversary, but they still could not touch it. Politically, the timing grew increasingly delicate. A major four-power summit was scheduled for May 16, 1960, in Paris. Presidents Eisenhower and Khrushchev were to meet with the leaders of France and Britain. Eisenhower, wary of the provocative U-2 flights, had actually ordered them suspended as the summit approached. But in a fateful decision, his advisors, including CIA Director Allen Dulles, persuaded him to authorize one final extensive mission in late April. They argued that the window for such intelligence was closing forever, and the need for a last look at Soviet ICBM sites was paramount. The mission, Operation Grand Slam, was approved. It would be the deepest, longest penetration yet, flying from Peshawar, Pakistan, across the entirety of the Soviet Union, over the Tyurata missile test range, the Sverdlovsk industrial heartland, the Plesetsk launch site, and the Northern Fleet bases, before landing in Bodo, Norway. The pilot selected was Francis Gary Powers, a 30-year-old former Air Force captain who had joined the CIA's U-2 program in 1956. He was experienced, steady, and familiar with the route. On April 27, he flew a preliminary mission from Peshawar to a base in Iran. Bad weather delayed the main flight. On the evening of April 30, Powers received his final briefing. He was issued a specially minted silver dollar containing a poison-tipped pin, a silent pistol, and survival gear. His cover story, should he go down, was ironclad. He was a NACA weather researcher who had strayed off course after experiencing a faulty oxygen system over Turkey. The CIA and the White House were confident. The plane was invulnerable. The story was plausible. The summit was 2 weeks away. But in Sverdlovsk, the PVO Strany had been placed on supreme alert. May Day was the USSR's most sacred secular holiday, a day of massive military parades showcasing Soviet power. It was the worst possible day for an American intrusion. All leaves were cancelled. Every radar operator, every missile crew, was at their post, straining for a sign of the ghost they had been ordered to kill. The technological race had reached its zenith. The political stakes could not have been higher. Two superpowers, one cloaked in secrecy and the other in overconfidence, were on a collision course. To understand the event, one must first understand the man at its center. Francis Gary Powers was not a stereotypical, swaggering jet ace. He was a quiet, introspective man from rural Kentucky, a skilled pilot valued for his meticulousness and calm under pressure. When he joined the CIA's U-2 program, he entered a shadow world. Officially, he worked for Lockheed as a test pilot for NACA. His neighbors, even some family, believed the cover. His salary was paid through a CIA front company. He was a civilian in every legal sense, a deliberate ploy to give the U.S. government plausible deniability. This legal fiction, however, placed an immense burden on the individual pilot. If captured, he could not claim the protections of the Geneva Convention as a prisoner of war. He was, in the eyes of international law, a spy, a fact that carried the potential of execution. The psychological isolation of the job was profound. Missions lasted up to 9 hours. The cockpit was a cramped, pressurized bubble. The pilot wore a full-pressure suit, a bulky rubberized cocoon that was his only lifeline above 50,000 feet. Outside, the temperature was minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was not blue but a deep, forbidding purple, the blackness of space visible above. He was utterly alone, a single consciousness suspended between the earth and the void, navigating by stars and a delicate autopilot, while beneath him an entire empire slept in ignorance of his passing. His primary task was to monitor a panel of instruments and keep the fragile aircraft in its narrow performance envelope. The actual espionage was done by the machine behind him. He was the custodian of a billion-dollar secret, a human component in a system of unprecedented technological arrogance. On the ground he was a family man with a wife and home. At altitude he was America's ghost, a role that required a specific, steely form of courage. Not the courage of dogfights but the courage of silent, sustained vulnerability. The Lockheed U-2 was not merely an aircraft, it was a physical manifesto of a strategic doctrine, the idea of absolute altitude. Every gram of its construction served the singular goal of climbing to a sanctuary where the laws of aeronautical engagement were rewritten. Its design was a series of ruthless compromises. The enormous, 80-foot wings provided the lift needed in the thin stratosphere, but they made the aircraft a nightmare to handle at lower altitudes, like flying a baby buggy with a clothesline, as one pilot described it. The single Pratt & Whitney J75 engine was tuned to siphon every ounce of thrust from the wispy air, but it operated perpetually on the edge of flameout. Its stealth was not of radar-absorbent materials, but of geometry and altitude. At 70,000 feet, it was a tiny, slow-moving speck against the immense backdrop of the sky, incredibly difficult for radar to track consistently. But its true genius was in its payload, the Type H Hicon camera. This was the raison d'etre of the entire project. The camera's 36-inch focal-length lens, peering through a series of quartz windows in the aircraft's belly, achieved a resolution estimated at 2 to 3 feet from mission altitude. It worked on a principle of panoramic strip photography, capturing a vast, continuous swath of terrain on 9.5-inch wide film. The detail was so exquisite that analysts could not only identify missile types but count the serial numbers on their transporters. The U-2's missions had already revolutionized intelligence. They proved the bomber gap was a myth and provided the first hard evidence of Soviet ICBM deployment at sites like Tyuratam. The aircraft was, in effect, a satellite before satellites were reliable. It created an illusion of omniscience in Washington, fostering a belief that the technological gap was unbridgeable. This belief bred operational complacency. The procedures, the flight paths, even the cover story had become routine. The machine was perfect. The doctrine was proven. This unshakable confidence would become the system's most critical vulnerability. These two angles, the vulnerable man and the invulnerable machine, were about to be subjected to a violent test. But to comprehend the shock of the event, we must also see it from the other side of the Iron Curtain, through the eyes of the hunters who had been patiently, furiously plotting their revenge. On the Soviet side, the pursuit of the U-2 was not just a military objective. It was a national crusade driven from the very top by Nikita Khrushchev's humiliation. The PVO Streny operated under a cloud of fear and fury. Failure was not an option. The commander of the PVO, Marshal Sergei Biryuzov, and the head of the Soviet rocket forces, Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, had personally overseen a crash program to adapt the S-75 Dvina (SE-2) system for high-altitude interception. This involved more than technical tweaks. It was a complete systemic overhaul. Radar regiments were repositioned to create overlapping zones of coverage along suspected U-2 flight corridors, particularly those leading to and from the sensitive ICBM test range at Tyuratam and the industrial Urals. Engineers pushed the Fansong radar systems beyond their design limits, increasing power output and adjusting frequencies to better detect the small, high-altitude signature. They developed new firing doctrines, authorizing the launch of multiple missiles, often in salvos of 3, to increase the probability of a kill through sheer volume of fire. Crews trained incessantly, drilling for the moment the elusive Angel track would appear on their scopes. But the system was fraught with peril, both technical and political. The S-75 was a formidable weapon, but it was also volatile. Its liquid fuel sustainer used toxic, corrosive propellants that required careful handling. The command guidance system was vulnerable to electronic countermeasures and required steady, unbroken radar contact. Most critically, the pressure from the Kremlin created a climate of desperation. Local commanders knew that to let another U-2 pass unchallenged could mean the end of their careers or worse. This pressure would lead to catastrophic decisions in the heat of engagement. The hunters were not just aiming for an aircraft, they were aiming to redeem their service, their technology, and their political leadership in a single, explosive act. While Soviet engineers worked on missiles, American officials perfected a different kind of weapon, the cover story. The entire U-2 program was enmeshed in an elaborate theater of deception. The aircraft were painted in non-military markings, simple black or natural metal finish with a fake NACA insignia. Pilots like Powers carried civilian identification, letters from non-existent employers, and even souvenir club cards. The CIA, with White House approval, had constructed a watertight narrative for the event of a crash. The pilot was a civilian weather researcher employed by NACA who had strayed off course after experiencing an oxygen system failure over a friendly border area like Turkey. This narrative was not just for Soviet consumption, it was for the world and for the American public. It was the cornerstone of plausible deniability, a concept that allowed the president and his administration to technically tell the truth while obscuring a colossal espionage operation. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, which had succeeded NACA in 1958, was unwittingly complicit, its public reputation for peaceful scientific research providing perfect camouflage. This facade bred a dangerous institutional arrogance. The belief in the U-2's invulnerability was so complete that contingency planning for a pilot's survival and capture was shockingly inadequate. The suicide pin was a morbid afterthought, not a coherent evasion plan. The assumption in Washington was simple. If a U-2 was ever hit, it would disintegrate completely at altitude, killing the pilot and destroying all evidence. No body, no plane, no proof. The cover story would remain unchallenged. This assumption turned the meticulous cover story into a potential trap, a web of lies that would hold only if the central premise of the pilot's death remained true. The entire strategy was a house of cards, built on the axiom of a corpse. When that axiom failed, the structure would collapse with devastating speed. These four angles, the pilot, the plane, the hunters, and the liars, were now converging on a single point in time and space. The calm, confident rituals of espionage were about to meet the chaotic, explosive reality of war. The moment of collision would shatter doctrines, expose fictions, and hinge on a single improbable fact. A man tumbling from the edge of space, very much alive. May 1, 1960. 6:26 Moscow time. Near Kirovohrad, Soviet Union. Francis Gary Powers crosses the Soviet border. His U-2, Article 360, is 4 hours into Operation Grand Slam. The flight has been routine. He has already overflown the Tyurata missile test range, his cameras capturing vital intelligence. He is now on the long leg north towards Sverdlovsk, a key industrial and military hub in the Ural Mountains. His detection gear, the primitive IDC-3 system designed to warn of Soviet radar locks, remains silent. The sky is a vast, empty cathedral. Beneath him, the Soviet Union celebrates May Day. In Sverdlovsk, the celebrations are secondary. The PVO Strany is at its highest state of alert. At AS-75 Dvina site commanded by Major Mikhail Voronov, radar operators have been tracking a faint high-altitude target for minutes. It is moving slowly, predictably. The distinctive signature, speed, altitude, course, matches the profile of their hated quarry. The order comes down the chain, engage. At approximately 8:53 local time, Voronov's battery launches 3 V-750 missiles. They roar skyward, climbing on pillars of flame and smoke. The launch is not a precise surgical strike. It is a calculated saturation of a block of airspace. 2 of the missiles will miss. 1 will not. In the stratosphere, Powers sees nothing. Hears nothing. The first sign of catastrophe is a dull orange flash to his left rear, followed instantly by a violent, concussive jolt. The proximity fuse of the first missile has detonated close to the U-2's tail. The shockwave is catastrophic for the delicate aircraft. The long, slender wings, stressed beyond their limit, fail. The right wing shears off first, then the left, folding upward and backward in a grotesque parody of flight. The fuselage, now a headless, wingless tube, begins a violent tumble. The cockpit section, bearing Powers, breaks away. For Powers, the world becomes a deafening, violent spin. The G-forces are immense, pinning him to his seat. He is tumbling, not falling, locked inside a disintegrating shell. The sky and earth trade places in a sickening blur. He cannot reach the ejection seat handles. Instinct and training take over. He fights to release the canopy, but the tumble prevents it. Finally, as the cockpit section stabilizes somewhat into a nose-down plunge, the canopy tears away on its own. The rush of air is explosive. Now he can eject. He pulls the ejection seat trigger. Nothing happens. The system has been damaged. He is still trapped in the disintegrating cockpit, falling from over 70,000 feet. In a final, desperate act, he manually releases his seat harness and is physically sucked out of the cockpit by the 400-knot slipstream. He is now a free-falling body in a pressure suit, tumbling through the thin, freezing air at an altitude where no human is meant to survive. His parachute is not the main chute stored in his ejection seat, which is now gone. It is the automatic, barometric release emergency parachute attached to his pressure suit. It is designed to open at 15,000 feet. As he plummets through that altitude, it deploys. The violent jerk of the canopy opening likely saves his life, stabilizing his descent. He drifts down, a lone, surreal figure beneath white silk, into a landscape of snow-dusted fields and pine forests. He can see a river, a road, a small village. He has a few minutes of silence to contemplate his reality. He is alive on Soviet soil with a plane full of espionage equipment destroyed around him. He lands awkwardly in a field, gathers his chute, and begins the futile ritual of survival, lighting a fire, unpacking his kit. He does not use the poison pin. The will to live is too strong. On the ground, the Soviet military is in chaotic motion. They have seen the missiles strike. They have seen the contrail break apart. They have found wreckage scattered over miles. The jubilation of the kill is immediate, but it is quickly tempered by confusion. Local peasants report seeing a parachute. A military patrol converges on Powers. He offers no resistance. He is captured not as a warrior, but as a dazed survivor, surrounded by curious Soviet soldiers who cannot believe what they are seeing. The first report that reaches Moscow is met with disbelief. The central assumption of both superpowers, that a shootdown at this altitude must be fatal, has just been obliterated. The technological event is over. The political and psychological event is just beginning. In Moscow and Washington, two governments now face a reality for which only one of them is prepared. The Kremlin. Night of May 1, 1960. The report lands on Khrushchev's desk. A U-2 has been destroyed near Sverdlovsk. The premier's initial reaction is one of triumphant vindication. Finally, the insult has been answered. But the next detail gives him pause. The pilot is alive. In custody. Unharmed. For Khrushchev, a master of political theater, this changes everything. A dead pilot is a mere incident, a classified trophy. A live pilot is a weapon. He immediately grasps the propaganda potential. He orders the news be kept secret from the world and from the Americans. He wants to see what story Washington will tell. In Washington, at CIA headquarters and the White House, there is only silence. Article 360 is overdue at Bodo, Norway. As hours stretch into a day, the grim realization sets in. The plane is down somewhere inside the USSR. But the doctrine holds firm. No one could survive. The cover story is activated. On May 3, NASA issues a press release. It states that a U-2 weather research aircraft, operated by NASA and piloted by a civilian contractor, has been missing since May 1 after its pilot reported oxygen difficulties over southern Turkey. Maps are prepared showing the purported flight path well clear of the Soviet Union. The State Department echoes the story. It is a calm, confident lie, told to an unsuspecting world. In Moscow, Khrushchev watches the American performance with cold delight. He has them in a trap of their own making. He bides his time. Soviet technicians, led by the KGB, are meticulously combing the Sverdlovsk debris field. Their findings are astonishing. They have recovered the largely intact tail section, the fuselage, the camera bay. Most critically, they have the Hycon-B camera and, miraculously, rolls of film. The film is developed in a Moscow lab. The evidence is irrefutable, crisp, detailed photographs of Soviet military installations. They also recover Powers' survival gear, his silenced pistol and the poison-tipped pin. They have the physical proof of espionage and they have the living proof, the pilot himself. Powers is in the hands of the KGB's first chief directorate, undergoing intensive interrogation at the notorious Lubyanka prison. His interrogators, including the future KGB chief Vladimir Semichastny, are initially baffled. Their technical experts had assured them survival was impossible. Yet here he is, physically fine, coherent. They press him on the ejection. They disbelieve his account of being blown free, suspecting a secret ejection system. They meticulously compare his story to the wreckage. Slowly they piece together the true chaotic sequence. Their bafflement turns to calculation. They have a priceless asset, a cooperative witness to American perfidy. On May 5, Khrushchev springs the trap. Addressing the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, he announces to thunderous applause that Soviet forces have shot down an American spy plane that violated Soviet airspace. He is deliberately vague. He does not mention the pilot's survival. He displays blown-up photographs of the wreckage. He revels in the lie, inviting the Americans to dig their grave deeper. In Washington, believing Powers dead, the administration doubles down. The State Department, on May 6, issues another statement. There was no deliberate intrusion. It was a weather plane that strayed off course. The lie is repeated, now directly into Khrushchev's open palm. 2 days later, on May 7, Khrushchev delivers the coup de grace. He takes the podium again. This time, his tone is one of theatrical, mocking triumph. "Comrades, I must let you in on a secret. When I made my report 2 days ago, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and in good health. And now just look at all the silly things the Americans have been saying." The chamber erupts. He reveals the evidence. The reconstructed camera, the photographs of Soviet bases, Power's personal effects. He quotes from Power's own diary recovered from the wreckage. The cover story is annihilated in a global spectacle of humiliation. The turning point is absolute and multifaceted. Technologically, the myth of the U-2's invulnerability is shattered. Politically, the United States is caught in a bald-faced lie on the world stage, its moral authority crippled. Diplomatically, the already fragile prospect of the Paris summit is mortally wounded. And personally, Francis Gary Powers ceases to be a missing pilot and becomes the central exhibit in a show trial, a living symbol of a failed doctrine. The shockwaves from this moment would not just end a flight or a summit. They would permanently freeze the Cold War into a new, more cynical and dangerous phase. With the cover story in ruins, Francis Gary Powers was transformed from a prisoner of the KGB into a central pawn in a global propaganda drama. Isolated in Lubyanka, he was subjected to a relentless interrogation regimen designed less to extract new intelligence. The Soviets had the plane and film, and more to condition him for a public performance. His interrogators mixed threats with promises, emphasizing that his only hope for life lay in full cooperation with the Soviet judicial spectacle. He was coached on what to say, how to behave, and was constantly reminded that his government had abandoned him, leaving him to face execution as a common spy. The show trial began on August 17, 1960, in the Hall of Columns in Moscow, the same venue used for the Stalinist purge trials of the 1930s. The atmosphere was meticulously stage-managed for an international audience. Powers, wearing a somber suit, appeared calm and compliant. He answered questions from the prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, with a quiet deference that many in the West misinterpreted as defeatism or even collaboration. He admitted to being a CIA pilot, detailed his mission, and expressed what sounded like regret. He did not plead innocent. His defense strategy, crafted by a Soviet-appointed lawyer, was to plead guilty while emphasizing he was a soldier following orders, not an ideologue. This was a calculated gamble to avoid the death penalty. On August 19, the verdict was delivered, guilty of espionage. The sentence, 10 years imprisonment with 3 years to be served in a Soviet prison and the remaining 7 in a labor camp. It was a surprisingly lenient sentence for a captured spy, and it was deliberately so. Khrushchev had no desire to make Powers a martyr. A live American prisoner was a continuing asset, a bargaining chip for a future trade. Powers was transported to Vladimir Central Prison, an ancient Tsarist-era fortress known for housing high-profile political prisoners. There he endured a monotonous, lonely existence, his fate tethered to the vagaries of U.S.-Soviet relations, which had been driven to a post-war low. The key to his release sat in an American prison. Rudolf Abel, a legendary Soviet intelligence officer, real name, William Genrikhovich Fischer, had been arrested in New York in 1957 and was serving a 30-year sentence for espionage. He was the KGB's premier illegal resident in the United States, a master spy. To the Soviets he was an invaluable officer. To the Americans he was the highest-ranking Soviet spy ever captured. For over 2 years, behind-the-scenes negotiations, often through East German intermediaries and lawyers, worked towards a swap. The exchange was orchestrated with the precision of a spy thriller. On February 10, 1962, on the Glienicke Bridge connecting West Berlin to Potsdam, a site that would become known as the Bridge of Spies, the two men were walked from opposite ends. Simultaneously, in a separate deal at Checkpoint Charlie, American student Frederick Pryor was released. There was no ceremony. Powers, looking thin and wary, crossed from the Soviet side. Abel, imperturbable as ever, crossed from the American. They passed in the center without a word. A few hours later, Powers was on a military flight to the United States, a free man. But freedom did not mean exoneration. He returned to a country deeply conflicted about him. Some, including factions within the CIA and the military, viewed him with suspicion. Why had he not used the poison pin? Why had he appeared so cooperative at the trial? Uninformed public opinion, fed on myths of wartime heroism, questioned why he hadn't fought to the death. He faced secret, hostile debriefings by the CIA and a closed-door hearing by the Senate Armed Services Committee. His eventual, unanimous vindication by the CIA and the committee, which concluded he had behaved as a fine man under dangerous circumstances, could not fully erase the stigma. He was a victim of the very plausible deniability doctrine he served. A civilian spy in a war without rules who had survived when the script demanded a martyr. His personal ordeal was over, but the strategic consequences of his flight and capture were now permanently etched into the fabric of the Cold War, altering espionage, diplomacy, and the very technology of seeing. The immediate, tangible consequence of the U-2 incident was the death of the Paris summit. When the leaders convened on May 16, 1960, just over a week after Khrushchev's theatrical revelation, the atmosphere was poisoned. President Eisenhower, in a fateful decision, had taken personal responsibility for the overflights, refusing to disavow actions he deemed necessary for national security. This honest but disastrous admission gave Khrushchev the high ground he sought. The Soviet premier stormed into the summit, demanding an American apology and a promise to cease all future flights. When Eisenhower refused to grovel, Khrushchev delivered a blistering tirade and walked out. The summit collapsed before substantive talks could begin. The hope for a thaw, for progress on Berlin or nuclear testing, evaporated. The Cold War plunged into a new deep freeze, setting a confrontational tone that would define the Kennedy administration and culminate in the Cuban Missile Crisis just 2 years later. Strategically, the era of the manned overflight was over. Operation Grand Slam was the last U-2 mission over the Soviet Union. The sanctuary of altitude had been breached. The CIA and the Air Force immediately pivoted with accelerated urgency to the next technological frontier: space. The Corona satellite reconnaissance program, which had suffered a string of humiliating launch failures, was suddenly granted unlimited priority. Just 4 months after Power's shootdown, on August 18, 1960, the Corona mission Discoverer 14 achieved the first successful recovery of film from orbit. Its single mission returned more imagery of the Soviet Union than all previous U-2 flights combined. The age of satellite espionage had truly begun, offering a permanence and inviolability that no aircraft could match. The U-2 found a new, if less dominant, role in tactical theater reconnaissance and would later prove invaluable in Cuba in 1962. For Soviet air defense, the shootdown was a monumental propaganda and professional victory, but it also exposed fatal flaws. In the chaotic engagement over Sverdlovsk, a Soviet MiG-19 piloted by Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov, scrambled to intercept the low-flying wreckage or parachute, was mistakenly shot down by a second salvo of S-75 missiles, killing the pilot. This friendly fire tragedy was buried by the state for decades. The incident revealed the lethal pressure and systemic dysfunction within the PVO Strany, where the desperation to kill the primary target overrode all other precautions. The deepest and most enduring scar, however, was on the fabric of international trust and diplomatic discourse. The U-2 incident laid bare a fundamental truth of the Cold War, that behind the public rhetoric of peaceful coexistence lay a relentless, clandestine struggle where lies were standard operating procedure. It demonstrated that both superpowers would engage in breathtaking acts of deception, and that when caught, the resulting humiliation could derail the fragile peace process for years. It taught a generation of policymakers that in the nuclear age, espionage was not a separate game. It was inextricably linked to the highest levels of diplomacy, capable of triggering geopolitical earthquakes. For Francis Gary Powers, life after the exchange remained complex. He worked for Lockheed for a time as a test pilot, but the notoriety followed him. He later became a traffic reporter for a Los Angeles radio station, piloting a helicopter, a poignant return to the skies in a mundane, public role. On August 1, 1977, he died when the helicopter he was piloting ran out of fuel and crashed in a Los Angeles neighborhood. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, a final, formal recognition of his service that had been so long debated. It was not until 2000 that the CIA posthumously awarded him the Director's Medal and the Prisoner of War Medal, and in 2012 he was awarded the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry, for staying with his aircraft as long as possible to avoid causing casualties on the ground, a final, official effort to lay the ghosts of suspicion to rest. The wreckage of Article 360 became a museum piece. Sections of the plane toured the Soviet Union as trophies. Today the remains are displayed in Moscow's Central Armed Forces Museum, a rusting relic of a closed, secret war. The incident stands as a stark monument to a time when the fate of the world could hinge on a single pilot, a single missile, and the profound disbelief that a man could fall from the edge of space and live to tell the tale. The debris was collected, the prisoner exchanged, the satellites launched. But the shadow of that May Day flight lingered, a permanent lesson in the limits of technology, the perils of arrogance, and the unpredictable human element at the heart of even the most calculated machines of war. The story of Francis Gary Powers and the U-2 is often told as a tale of technology, of an aircraft that flew too high and a missile that flew higher still. But at its core it is a profoundly human story. It is a story about the limits of doctrine when it meets the chaos of reality. For 4 years the United States operated on a doctrine of absolute altitude, a belief that a machine could create a perfect, untouchable shield. The Soviet Union operated on a doctrine of inevitable retaliation, a belief that national humiliation could not stand. Both doctrines were logical. Both were backed by science, engineering, and political will. And both were rendered incomplete by a single, simple biological fact. A man survived. This survival was the anomaly that changed history. It transformed a potentially deniable clandestine incident into an inescapable public confrontation. It turned a pilot from a classified asset into a global icon of Cold War duplicity. It forced lies into the light and shattered the careful fiction of plausible deniability, proving that in the nuclear age secrets had a half-life, and cover stories could be blown apart by the very wind that brought a parachute to Earth. The legacy of May 1, 1960, is not merely the shift from aerial to satellite espionage, or the deepening of Cold War animosity. It is a cautionary parable about the hubris of certainty. It reminds us that in the intricate, deadly dance between superpowers, the most meticulously calculated plans, the perfect aircraft, the impregnable cover story, the fail-safe doctrine, are perpetually vulnerable to the unpredictable. A missile's proximity fuse, a pilot's will to live, a leader's thirst for theatrical revenge. The U-2 incident carved a permanent lesson into the bedrock of international relations, that trust, once obliterated by exposed deception, takes decades to rebuild, if it ever can. Today the purple twilight of the stratosphere is once again a domain of silent surveillance, not by manned gliders, but by autonomous machines and orbiting sensors. Yet the human element remains, now as then, the ultimate variable. The wreckage in the museum and the headstone in Arlington stand as quiet, complementary testaments. One speaks of technology fallen to earth, the other of the man who fell with it, and in surviving forced the world to look, without illusion, at the fragile truths upon which its peace precariously rests. The contrail faded. The lies were exposed. The summit crumbled. But from the silence that followed, a clearer, harder, and more enduring understanding emerged. In the high-stakes game of nations, it is not the invulnerability of the machine that ultimately matters, but the vulnerable, resilient, and unpredictable human at the controls.